forward on this one. Perfect. Thank you guys. I will pass it on to Kealohi and Damar.
Hi, everybody.
Hello.
Thank you for being patient with us as we try to figure this out. This whole series has been a learning project for all of us as we try to navigate, having in-person and Zoom presentations. So thank you for sticking through it. My name is Dee. I use she, her pronouns.
And I'm Kealohi. I also use she, her pronouns.
And for today's session, we're going to be leading a transformational leadership training. So we're going to have an emphasis on diversity, equity, and inclusion. Kealohi will lead us in this next part.
So I really wanted to start off this session by calling an emphasis on different indigenous cultures. For me specifically, I am Native Hawaiian. And so I like to start every space that I'm leading and facilitating with this chant called E Homai, which helps focus our group's energy and helps carry out our kuleana, which is our responsibility or our calling. And so with this, we really want to make sure that we can find the knowledge, clear our headspace, clear out any negativity, and open ourselves to receiving. I'm going to take off my mask if everyone's okay with that. It feels weird to chant with it on. And also the lyrics are on the right side if you want to see the English and Spanish translation. E homai kike mai luna mai e ona mea huna no e au ona mele e homai e homai e homai e homai kike mai luna mai e ona mea huna no e au nona mele e homai e homai e homai e homai kike mai luna mai e ona mea huna no e au nona mele e homai e homai e homai e. Mahalo nui. Thank you, everyone. I hope this helps center you, clear out any negativity in this space, call upon whatever higher source, ancestors, gods, deities, that helps keep you focused and present in this space. So thank you.
Thank you for leading us in that beautiful chant, Kealohi. We're going to start off with a land acknowledgement. So as we know, all of the land in what is modern day United States is occupied indigenous land. And so for the area that we reside in, which is modern day Denver, this is land of the Cheyenne, the Ute, and the Arapaho, as well as 48 other nation and tribes that have passed through here, that have resided here, and who still currently live and reside here. This little graphic on the side says, all wealth is built on stolen land, stolen labor, and stolen lives. And so Kealohi really asked at our last presentation for some other people to step up to this role and feel comfortable in sharing a land acknowledgement and leading this part of our presentation. And she asked the question, why is this important? And so we would love to open it up again. We had one person share last time, so if anybody has something that they would like to share, we would love to hear why you all think that having a land acknowledgement is important.
To recognize the tribes that lost their lives and who had to move off their native land, and to know that this land was stolen, it wasn't given.
Anyone else?
I think it's also good just to remember, like we're not always like telling ourselves like we're on this land because it's stolen. Like we don't remind ourselves that on the daily. So it's good that every once in a while we bring it out and remind ourselves that we're on this land and we have to respect it as much as we can because it's not ours.
Yeah, thank you, Naomi. It's really important that we're conscious of this so that we can be intentional in what we do on this land, with this land, and alongside of the land. Danny would like to share?
Danny, feel free to share if you can.
Just short, I always like to keep my mind focused that we don't own the land. The land does not belong to people. We belong to the land. And when we start to put that in our mind and think that way and stop having that possessiveness over all material things, we have a lot more peace. Gracias.
Thank you, Danny. That's a really great way to think of it. We don't own the land. We are in service to the land to upkeep and make sure that we are doing right by her. So thank you for calling attention to that. And so thank you everyone for sharing. Hopefully we have more people who feel called to share for the next session. We hope that everyone's learning a lot through this. So with that, we're going to keep moving forward and go into our community guidelines. And so this conversation is going to be centered around diversity, equity, and inclusion, which can be a very difficult conversation to be having. It can get uncomfortable doing this personal work and really trying to unlearn and learn new things. So we want to make sure that everyone is supporting learning, listening to others to understand, try not to make our own assumptions or conclusions, just really try and listen to what they're saying before speaking. Also share from your own experience by using I statements. And so that helps ensure that we're not perpetuating any kinds of stereotypes or speaking from other identities that we don't hold ourselves. Also share the space, so please be respectful of others while they're speaking. Keep yourself muted if you're not talking. And also, just giving them that space to share and hold space for any emotions that might come up for that as well. And also another thing would be to take the lessons and themes that we learn here and not the stories, because we don't want to go around saying, well, Dee shared her trauma about all these different things. And that could be an invasion of privacy. So really try and hone in on those lessons.
Yeah, these are super important to ensure that we are being respectful of each other and that we feel safe, being vulnerable, because these conversations need honesty and transparency to really get at the messages that we're trying to send and to make sure that it's a learning opportunity for everybody. So with that, we would like to define 4 key vocabulary words, and we would actually love if each person or one person could read a definition at a time. Would anyone like to start us off with privilege?
I will.
Awesome, thank you, Brenda.
Thank you.
Privilege, a special right, advantage, or immunity granted or available only to a particular person or group.
Thank you. Yeah, it's important to acknowledge that privilege is not a dirty word. Every person has privilege in one way or another, even if it's not as obvious. Would anyone like to read for diversity?
I'll do diversity.
Thank you, Chevy.
The practice or quality of including or involving people from a range of different identities.
We hear that this word has become very mainstream in the last couple of years. Everybody likes to say that they have diversity in their organization, diversity in their company, but really we're going to dive into what exactly that means to have diversity in an organization, and especially in community groups. Inclusion. Could we get somebody from Zoom?
Yo lo puedo leer.
I can read it. The practice or policy of providing equal access to opportunities and resources for people who might otherwise be excluded or marginalized.
Gracias, Maria Elsa. And for intersectionality, this one's a big word. Can we get someone over Zoom again?
I can read it.
Thank you, Lola.
Intersectionality, aspects of a person's social and political identities combine to create different modes of discrimination and privilege.
Thank you for reading that. We also want to call attention to the fact that the term intersectionality was coined by Kimberly Crenshaw, who saw the lack of analysis between different identities. And so she saw that, especially in terms of laws, as a Black queer woman, she wasn't able to see, like they were different trials, like you could either be Black or a woman. And so she coined this term so that we can have a more detailed analysis and know that these two identities aren't separate, they're intertwined.
And so the terms diversity and inclusion always seem to be used together, and sometimes they're used very interchangeably. People will say diversity when they really mean inclusion, or say inclusion when they mean diversity. So we'd love to hear what y'all think is the difference between diversity and inclusion.
Diversity to me is like people from different backgrounds. So they might want a diverse setting with different people. And then inclusion is including everybody. So like, it's just not going to be like one group of people. They want to see like a mix of different people and sexes and stuff like that to make them feel a part of.
Yeah, it's very key, you know, like who's included and who's not included. Because in diversity, you could have, you know, a Black person, a Hispanic person, and you say that's diversity. But what about like Asian folk? What about Native American folk? That's not being inclusive, right? So you can be diverse without being inclusive.
Another reason why we put diversity and inclusion right next to each other on this definition sheet is because you can see that it's the practice or quality of including versus inclusion is the practice or policy of providing. And so I like to remember the difference as diversity is an adjective. It describes how a space is, but inclusion is a verb. It's how we actively make sure that people are heard, make sure people are seen, and feel accepted within a space. So thank you everyone for participating in this. These are going to be some important terms we should remember as we continue on the conversation. So feel free to take a picture of this, write them down if you need it to draw back to, because we will keep moving on right now.
They will also be sent in a follow-up email.
So we have a quick video right here, and it's going to be about power, privilege, and oppression.
Think of a baby when it's born as a simple stick figure. Pretend identity is like the first set of clothes given to them by others who expect them to wear that.
The captions in Spanish, you know?
If you press captions and then do the little, what's it called? On the right hand, like there's a little toolbar, a little tool symbol.
Oh, no, we didn't.
Yeah, right there. And you can choose auto generator. Then you scroll down and it'll be in Spanish. Oh, she got the touch screen. Okay.
You do too.
Me too.
Okay, I think, did it work? Let's see.
Style throughout their life. Now consider their personal style. Might be color or hairstyle, as clothes that they would pick to best match their personality. Likewise, gender identity is shaped at birth when a doctor assigns gender. Grandparents then begin to describe boys as having strong cries or give girls pink headbands with bows. For some, gender assignment and all that is associated with it is without conflict. As we mature, we carry this assigned identity as we engage with social structures like schools. Cisgender kids go into their assigned boys or girls bathroom without hesitation. Walking into a different bathroom is met with redirection. For transgendered and genderqueer people, however, the assignment of gender at birth is painful. Their identities create tensions and are in opposition to assigned gender roles, behaviors, and expectations from friends, family, and society. They worry, which bathroom is safe for me? This tension also happens around language. In the US, English is considered a primary or sole language, and this affects everyone's identity. Unless you're in a foreign language class or a bilingual school, there can be stigma about speaking languages other than English in the classroom or in the playground. You may receive messages that English is the only acceptable language in school. The social messaging is that speaking another language is shameful and problematic, while speaking English, ideally without an accent, is rewarded as good behavior. In this way, Spanish-speaking family members are stigmatized as others, and speaking Spanish becomes undesirable. This process explains why, regardless of country of origin, children of non-English speakers lose their language by the third generation. These are just a couple examples that demonstrate how social structures construct, limit, and place value on identities. This becomes highly problematic when school completion, racial profiling, poverty, and health disparities are associated with specific identities. Social messages from schools, peers, and the media are conflicting. They tell us that all men are created equal despite what is actually reinforced by everyday interactions, like the classic example of a white woman guards her purse in the elevator when a Black man enters. A clash begins when the social messaging and the actual experiences do not match. We cannot be equal if we define one group as better or even superior to another based on gender or racial identification. Whiteness is the preferred norm, the identity that all other identities are compared to or contrasted against. The norm of whiteness is so strong that it is invisible. For instance, when describing a person, if their race is not described, the assumption is that they are white. Inequality touches all parts of our lives. Even when we're thinking of starting a healthy family, we assume that education, income, and healthy lifestyles should produce the same healthy birth outcomes regardless of race in the US. Yet research indicates that regardless of age, education, income, and health behaviors, and unrelated to genetics, Black women in the US have poorer birth outcomes than their white counterparts. Black women experience increased infant deaths, maternal deaths, and low birth weights. Many scientists associate the resulting poorer birth outcomes to increased stress related to experiences of racism. But how do we have social change and equity when those who are most affected can be demoralized and frustrated by their everyday attempts to achieve the same outcomes as their white counterparts? Our relationship to identity groups can be the key to creating change. Since social inequities occur predominantly to communities of color, social transformation requires, among other things, a mobilization of identity. Social movements based in identity, such as the Black Liberation Movement, the Chicano Movement, and the Women's Rights Movement, harness identity by educating people about social structural inequality and its impact on them. In this way, social movements can create an educated counter-narrative. Stories like that of Benjamin Banneker, a Black architect who was hired by Thomas Jefferson to build the White House after the French architect Pierre-Charles L'Enfant stormed off the job. This exemplifies Banneker's invisibility in U.S. history and the prominence of L'Enfant, who has a metro stop named after him in Washington, D.C. Knowing the invisible history and cultural icons of communities can be used to coalesce people of a shared identity and can call forth other successful historical struggles. For instance, the United Farm Workers Union and their leaders Cesar Chavez and Dolores Huerta carried banners of Our Lady of Guadalupe as they marched from Delano to Sacramento, California to demand justice for farm workers. The same icon was used by Father Miguel Hidalgo in Mexico's fight for independence from Spain and again in the Mexican Revolution by Emiliano Zapata. The way that these icons were used are also evidence that global and national struggles for transformational change can be organized at local levels. As people committed to social change, the questions for us are, how much do we really understand about the history and legacies of the communities in which we work? And as both insiders and outsiders of these communities, how do we use the power of narrative informed by cultural histories of contribution, resistance, and justice to activate change in grassroots community organizing? Think of a baby when it's born as a simple stigma.
Awesome. Thank you everyone for staying tuned with that and watching that with us. I hope you all liked it. I know I personally really like the drawings. I just love that kind of animation. As you can see on our shared screen, we wanted to highlight the last two questions that they were asking because I think they were very powerful. And we think it's something that we should keep with us as we keep moving forward in this conversation and past this conversation. So the first question says, how much do we understand the history and legacy of our communities? And the second question is, how do we use the power of narrative to activate change in our community? So keep these in the back of your mind. Hopefully we're going to be able to use our own narratives as we're sharing today through the activities, and we can start to learn the history and what kind of legacy we're going to leave behind in our community.
Think of a baby when it...
Does anyone feel called to share a response to either of these questions?
And if not, that's okay. We can come back to it at the end.
It was a lot.
It was a lot. The video is a lot to process. There's a lot of new information.
A comment on that first one, I would say, was like a language. The video brought a good point that language, and if you don't, native languages in this continent had a very different structure that was forbidden and needs to be kind of like reinstituted in some areas of society.
Definitely. There's a lot of outside forces beyond just social stigma and pressure that also isn't always taught in our school systems, and which is important why we educate ourselves and talk to people, learn people's narratives in order to hear that history personally. So thank you, Danny, for calling attention to that.
Hi, sorry guys. Can you guys hear me?
Yes.
Sorry, I've been like on juggling meetings, but I can finally speak. My name is Biani, she, her, ella, and I can speak to the second question, the power of narrative. So I work like in communications, so I think it's very powerful when we think about narrative and how we, communicate with community and like using community first language, always thinking about the people that you are talking about and the people, like the narrative that you were saying, so the stories that you're telling, and making sure that you're not like whatever you put out there, that it's going to be good for the greater good. And that's kind of like always the motto, is always trying to do good for everybody and keeping community at mind and making sure that you're doing that in a proper way. So I think the power of narrative is very powerful in this work, and you kind of have to use that to change the community, without narratives and stories, we can't change anybody's minds about, anything. So yeah, that's kind of my spiel about the second one.
Thank you for being here with us. I'm really glad that you could join us.
Yeah, I was so happy to make it.
It's a good point because it talks about how you see how much digital stories are becoming so much popular. And stories were the way that our ancestors and native communities taught their histories.
And I just want to add that it's nice that we're talking about it, because I know the last couple of generations, they felt like they couldn't talk about it just to keep the peace.
Yeah.
So that's nice that we're speaking up and, you know, paving the way for the ones coming after us.
Exactly.
And that goes into what kind of legacy are we leaving behind for our communities? Like what legacy was left for us before we came into this?
I also feel like in this space with Shared and Rising, it's really important to be like in a safe space so that you feel comfortable to share your story. I'll give an example. At our last SPTA meeting, a youth and I shared a presentation around what LGBTQ means. And I got kind of emotional because I started sharing like my coming out story and how that was for me. And I was really nervous beforehand because when I came out, the older generations in my community were very mean, to say the least. You know, there's not enough acceptance. And I think, you know, there's this big generational gap. But when I was in that space the past, like a couple weeks ago, everybody was super sweet. Like in that space, there were a lot of like older Hispanic women. And instead of like being faced with some backlash or homophobia, like everybody was very open-minded, very sweet, asking questions if they didn't know. And it opened up a space for like everybody to share their stories about like how they accepted their sibling when they came out, or how they accepted like their child when they decided to like share their story. So the power of narrative is, like being said, very, very powerful. And it can bring our community together when you open up that space for people to be vulnerable. So I can definitely see how that's already impacting the community of Sheridan. If no one else would like to share, we can move on to the next part.
And please feel free to bring this up at any point. Anything we talk about here is not off the table. Anything can always be brought up again.
So now we'd like to talk a bit about identity. So what identity is, it's really who you are. It's the way that you think about yourself, the way that you are viewed by the world, and the characteristics that define you. So many of these identities can change over time as, you know, people learn more about themselves. And also as like people go about their life, making changes, strives to change, such as like people's documentation status can change over time. As youth are discovering themselves, their sexual identity can change over time. And there are also invisible identities that aren't physically visible, you know, such as your gender identity. We cannot assume that we know what someone's gender identity is by the way they present. Also people's religion, and once again, like people's sexuality. So identity is not always something that you can assume by looking at somebody. It is something that you learn by asking questions, getting to know each other. And we would like to dive into an activity for us to really look into like what are our own personal identities, and then have a conversation about, you know, how do our identities relate to one another. So Naomi will drop the Word doc in the chat, and for everybody here in person, we'll have a couple of copies.
Does everyone have a pen?
Yeah, I have one.
iPad extra.
And this activity, I feel like it's used in a lot of spaces. You usually see it in like an identity wheel, but we decided to make our own because we didn't like any of the templates online. They didn't feel very like culturally relevant. And so this was like an activity that we've done multiple times in a lot of spaces that we've been in. And we feel like this activity really helps people open up, not only to the people around them, but to themselves. And it makes you think about what identities you don't think on a day-to-day basis, and how privilege comes up in your life, and in the identities that you hold. We'd also like to dive into some like explanations for some of these categories.
Let me post a file really quickly.
So I'm gonna give it a second. so that we can get everyone having the sheet. For everyone who has the sheet in front of them, have you seen something like this before? No? Awesome, awesome. This will be fun. New activity.
Do you want us to post it in the chat?
If you can, there's like a little option that says file that
Oh.
might let you in chat. Mine just says that the connection's bad.
I have a pretty strong connection. And if you want, if you could share the screen, maybe people could just write it down. So if you have a pen and paper with you, if we're not able to get this link sent to you, it'll be in a Word document. So also if you can't open a Word document on whatever device you're on, just take a look at that and try and write something down on the side.
Okay, cool. So yeah, take a screenshot.
All right, so we just dropped it in the chat if you want to open it up and edit directly on it. If not, go ahead and just look over at it. Okay, since this is the first time that some of y'all have seen this, we want to give a little bit of definitions as to what these categories are. So the first one that we really wanted to emphasize is the difference between race and ethnicity, because usually people use this interchangeably. So race is often used to define someone by their skin color or other physical, social, biological attributes. This is also with your relationship to power. So race is a way to access power and not access power. Historically, there are 5 races and they're all associated with color. So white, black, brown, the last 2 are a little bit, borderline derogatory. Red and yellow, meaning Asian, Native American. The brown is just generally anyone who doesn't fall into black, white, red, yellow. So take that as you will. We wanted to include them in here because, even if we don't want to use those, it's the reality of the world and the society that we're living in that race is coming up every single time. So we can't say that we want to be colorblind just because we don't agree with it, because that's just neglecting the power that comes with the attributes. Ethnicity, on the other hand, is your cultural, national, or linguistic background or origin. So this is whatever culture you identify with. For example, I identify with Vietnamese, Native Hawaiian, Japanese culture because that is where all of my family is from, and that's what I was raised with.
And this is always a tricky question to decipher race and ethnicity. Who's filled out like demographic forms and like you don't identify with like some of the topics, or you don't know, like for the ethnicity, it's always either you're Hispanic or Latino or you're not.
Yeah.
Like those are the only
Hispanic,
options,
like,
right? And it's really important to know that these are like based off of like societal structures. So it's not like something biological. It's something that was created, at the start of all these systems of power to keep people oppressed, to make some people better than others, to have some people be elite and some people to be oppressed. And so this is always like a tough subject to touch on and to teach, because one could say that neither of these exist because they're social constructs. But they do exist and they perpetuate power and oppression. So it's important to recognize those.
So the next category that might be a little bit confusing is gender versus sex. So sex often refers to a person's physical characteristics, specifically the reproductive organs that they were born with. So, when a baby's born, they're either given male or female, but, it's not as cut and clean as that. There are people in our world who exist as intersex. And so what this means is that they could be born with both a uterus and other reproductive organs of opposite sex. And so, it doesn't necessarily mean that they can identify with either. Many people haven't heard of what intersex people are because our sex education is not very good. It's not very inclusive at all. And in case you're wondering, like, how many people are there in the world? Well, in the US, there's the same amount of intersex people as there are redheads. And so that's a good comparison. So I don't know the exact percentage, but if you've seen redheads out there, you've probably seen people who you didn't know who were intersex. Again, it's one of those invisible identities.
And gender is different than sex because gender encompasses a person's expression of their gender. So somebody can identify as non-binary, somebody can identify as transgender, somebody can identify as like unsure, they don't know what they identify as. So it's really important to separate, sex is the physical organs that you have at the time of your birth, and gender is the way that you express yourself, the way that you want to name your own experience. So a person may identify with a gender that is different from their natal sex or identify with no gender at all. So it's really important to like recognize those differences. And again, it's like a point of confusion for some folks who don't have as much experience or who don't know people who identify as different than the binary. So it can be confusing. I feel like nowadays when I talk to youth, it's very like, oh, everybody knows that, like everybody can understand that. And I know that like for me, it was like kind of difficult when I was sitting in like my college class when they were talking about sex versus gender. So it's something that like we should be willing to like talk about and to really discuss and open to learn, because nowadays like people are becoming more confident in expressing their gender identities, and so we need to learn how to be respectful and open-minded, because I've heard like a lot of parents who are having trouble with understanding like what their child is going through, and so being able to like even just identify like what is that difference between their sex and their gender can make a big difference in their life.
Mm-hmm. The next section that we wanted to go over is abilities. And so, you could interpret this as like, I can draw or I can paint, that's one way to interpret it. But the way that we have it on here on our sheet is if you are able to do certain things without having to think about them. So you can have mental abilities, physical, emotional abilities. Oftentimes, there's a lot of ableism. Because a lot of people are able-bodied and they don't think about, oh, is this wheelchair accessible for me? Is this going to have, closed captions for someone who is deaf? Is there going to be like different modes of interpretation, different modes of accessibility in order to carry on with our daily lives?
Yeah, so we'd like to take a couple minutes for y'all to fill this out. And then we'd like to come back for a discussion and really just chat about how have you experienced privilege in your identities, and on the other hand, how have you experienced depression because of your identities. So everybody take a minute to fill this out. Feel free to ask any questions.
Mm-hmm. And this would be a really great time to remember our definitions of intersectionality, where these identities combine to create a unique experience for yourself.
I'm like,
Damar,
Yeah,
do we get a link or do we have to do it on a separate paper?
there was a link sent in the chat. It's like a Word document. Can you access it?
Es que me metí tarde, yo creo no alcancé a agarrarlo. Sorry.
Oh, you're good. We'll resend it.
Okay, thank you.
Danny, can you see the link now?
Yo tampoco lo miro, disculpen.
This is Maria. I can't see it either.
Maybe it's because
Tal vez porque estoy en la teléfono, no se miro.
If you're in the telephone, maybe you can't see the chat box. Probably it's because I'm on my phone, says Maria.
Yeah.
I don't see it in the chat box either.
Okay. So it seems like if you're on your phone, you probably can't access it because it's a Word document. So would you all mind like taking a screenshot and then writing like on a piece of paper or in your notes your response to each? Because we will be going into breakout rooms so that we can discuss after this. Is that okay with everybody?
That's fine with me.
Thank you, Lucy. Is everyone ready to go into breakout rooms for discussion? Looks like we might need another minute. Okay. Okay, it looks like some people are finishing up. So we're gonna open up the breakout rooms now. And we'll give like 5 minutes, 6 minutes. Okay, we'll go till 6:40 and then we'll come back to the main session.
And it's okay if you don't have them all answered right now. You can keep going like as you're in your group.
Okay.
Yes.
Okay, all of you guys have been invited to join your breakout room. So you can go ahead and accept the invitation and move into your breakout rooms.
I can send it in the chat if it's easier to send.
Let's see.
Okay.
I wonder if that's sent to everybody.
I think there's an option on your end to send a message to everyone.
Oh, okay.
Oh, right there, it says broadcast message to all.
Where?
Right next to the close all the rooms.
Okay, cool. Thank you.
That's okay. All right, is everyone here ready to talk about this?
Yeah.
Got it. Mhm.
I didn't know how to answer abilities or national origin.
That's okay. So, did you answer those ones, Brenda?
Yes. So for abilities, I put I'm intuitive and I feel like I'm a good caretaker. And for national origin, I put U.S. citizen.
I really like that you expanded on like your qualities. That's really nice. I think that's a really good way to like identify yourself with like the characteristics because there's so many different ways that you can identify. The way that I answered the abilities question is that I'm able-bodied. So I don't have to worry about like accessibility needs. Like I can hear, I can see, I can walk. I don't have like underlying health issues, like especially during the pandemic. It's like there's so many things that you're like, oh, there's so many accessibility things that we didn't realize.
I'm gonna move Sam
It's
to
interesting though,
room
because
3.
how the pandemic makes so many things
And I'm gonna
accessible.
put
Right.
So we're hoping
Barry
it
to
stays.
room
And that
2.
kind of go into privilege.
Exactly.
And then I'm gonna put
So does that
Nelly.
give some insight?
Yeah, you said that you answered it like able-bodied. Okay. I was like,
Should I put
when
Nelly
I
with
think
us?
about like race
I
and
mean-
ethnicity, I'm like check boxes, but I didn't know what check boxes. Let's see
Yeah.
there.
Oh wait, Nelly is with us right now.
Yeah.
Nelly, can you hear us?
Yeah, but it's taking me out like every 10 minutes. So sorry, I apologize. My internet.
You're okay. And
You can stay here if
then
you want.
Yeah.
Is there anyone from Zoom who'd like to share?
Imelda, Lola.
I think Lola's at work.
Oh,
So-
okay. Yeah, she might be busy.
You wanna share?
Are we sharing the whole chart?
If you want. You don't have to share anything you're not comfortable with.
Okay. There were a couple where I filled it out and then I went back and I erased it. For race, I originally put Mexican, but then I went back and I just put brown. I was like, I should just be more broad. Because sometimes I feel like I can't claim like Mexican as my race because my national origin is in the United States. So for ethnicity, I hate that question. I mean, like, I feel when I fill out demographic forms, like, I always put like Hispanic or Latino. But then for the race, like, I don't fit into any of those categories. So I always defaultly choose white because I was like, okay, well, I'm born in the United States, so like, I guess that makes me white. In comparison to like my mother and like her family. But the other day I was actually filling out a demographic form for her. It was for the Section 8 vouchers, and she didn't fit into any of them. Like she can't even choose white because she's like Mexican through and through. And so I was like, I don't know what to put. And in the end, like it wouldn't let us move forward without choosing one. And so in the end, like I like miscategorized her and like put her as white because there were no other options. And so I feel like I always struggle with that. So for ethnicity, I actually put Chicana. I feel like I feel more comfortable in that identity because it acknowledges that I am both, I am Mexican American, but I'm not from here and I'm not from there. It's like that saying, ni de allí, ni de allá.
Do you want to share how your identities, or like which identities you feel combined to give you privilege or oppression?
Yeah, I think that Definitely being born in the US and being college educated. Also being a cisgender woman gives me a lot of privilege, as well as being able-bodied. I feel like some aspects in which I feel more oppressed, I guess, is with my socioeconomic class. So I'm of working class. You know, I come from an ancestry of poverty, and my sexual orientation is like as a lesbian. That's just how I identify. Sometimes I feel like my age, because like I work with youth, like everybody knows that I work with youth. And I feel like in a lot of spaces in which we work with partners who are older, or like that we like work with people who are most of the time older, like there's a lot of ageism, a lot of like, you don't know what you're doing, a lot of like, let me do it because you can't do it right. And I feel like I have to deal with that on a day-to-day basis. And it's like, it's not usually directed towards me. It's like towards like the kids that I work with. But it's being like their supervisor, like it feels like it comes back to me. So that's like one of the areas. Would anyone like to share how they've experienced privilege in their identities and or oppression?
Do you want me to go back to the movie?
I think we've done like another 2 minutes maybe.
Yeah.
When everyone feels comfortable, like if we carry this discussion into the bigger group, you don't have to share, but you know, feel comfortable having that.
Should we go back now?
Oh,
Say
okay.
2 minutes.
Okay.
Whatever. It's fine.
Do you want to share this?
Okay, no pressure.
Is there any that y'all didn't fill out?
Just those two initially.
Yeah.
For ethnicity, I didn't know to put white.
Well, that could go for race because it would fit into the 5 colors. But if you feel called to put that, you also don't have to put that if you don't want. Ethnicity is more so the culture that you grew up with and that you associate with the most. So for me, I put down Vietnamese, Hawaiian, Japanese.
I don't know if you have to put broadcast.
Oh yeah.
I don't think it's.
Oh, I didn't let them know. Thank you. And then abilities, I also didn't know what to put, and I like spaced out during it.
You're our IT person.
Yeah.
Well, for mine, I put able-bodied because I don't have any disabilities and I don't face any obstacles like in my daily life, in like doing like physically doing things.
Okay.
So I usually put able-bodied.
And that could also include like mental and emotional abilities as well. You know, like learning, like depression, anxiety, like those things can be like, I want to use the word habilidades. I was like, I don't know, combining the 2 words, but ability.
The one that I didn't fill out was religion. Because I was raised Catholic, but I don't practice it. Like I've been like confirmed, so like I'm like in there now.
Yeah.
But like I don't go to church. Like my auntie's on here, so like I'm nervous she's listening.
I just put spiritual.
That's good.
Yeah.
I like that.
Because religion can get tricky. But you all have a higher power.
Yeah.
I don't feel like it's much privilege being African American, just because I know that like just in general we're seen like at the lowest on the totem pole. I feel like you always have to like be perfect because somebody's always highlighting what you didn't do versus what you did. But I mean, you know, there's obviously you know, benefits. Like I'm not ashamed of who I am, but like I can't say that there's any privileges in America. I know that they use these like because I'm in healthcare, So they ask these questions for like insurance purposes and billing purposes. And the community just really got to a place to like, they just want to categorize like us. Like they don't even see us like people as an individual. Like they don't break it down like this, you know, kind of thing. Like I took my son to a doctor's appointment and they were like asking him like just these random questions. And I was like, where is this coming from? And they're like, well, this is the new format. And I had to like reject some of the questions because I know these questions lead up to other things and they have a file kind of thing. But you know, I guess on the other side, I'm able to get like charitable donations. Not saying that that's anything to glorify, but because of my socioeconomic, you know, class, you know, like when COVID hit, I was able to get some resources. The downside is, you know, just trying to have that mental balance, stability, because, you know, I always have to like bring it in, like, who am I? You know, I'm not who they say I am. Because, you know, being in healthcare, like I'm constantly like questioned, my work is questioned kind of thing. It's like, no, I know what I'm doing. Not being treated equally. And another thing is like just being, you know, a heavier set Black woman, you know, they're like, oh, you're strong, independent, single, no man, you know, you're fussy, you're this or you're that. And I'm constantly, you know, trying to break that rhetoric because that's not who I am. Like, I'm a woman. I'm not going to, you know, go pick up 100-pound boxes and, you know, haul trucks and, you know, things like that. Like, no, I'm a woman. Like, what do you mean? I'm single because I choose to be. You know, kind of thing. It's like, you know, I'm getting my education. It's not because I'm like, I don't need a man. So that's, you know, difficult. My ethnicity, I put of African descent in Spanish, female, girl, heterosexual, US citizen, English. I have vocational training, high school diploma, some training, some training. I would say I'm lower middle class, barely, and I'm 36 in spiritual.
Thank you for sharing.
Yeah.
No problem. Really appreciate it.
Thank you.
I feel like you touched on such an important thing, like about all the stereotypes and like how that like plays into your experience and like with all these different identities like together, like as a Black woman and not just like as a woman or just like as a Black person. Like it combines to have that expectation of you being this strong, like amazing, like mega Hulk or something.
Yeah, like I could do everything.
Yeah,
because I work in Highlands Ranch and, you know,
Oh,
oh my gosh. Oh my gosh. It's like, I gotta like just, like just not even pay attention and not give them that reaction that they want. Because people really play off of stereotypes that are perpetuated in commercials and movies. It's like, how do we get away from that? Because I'm no different than my counterpart. But like that video said, is like they see white women as first, you know? So, but I know that's not true.
We know that's not
we know that's not true.
Do you want to close the room spell now? Thank you so much.
I feel like that also brings us back to like the question of diversity. Like as soon as you said Highland Ranch, I was like, yeah, affluent white people.
Oh
like,
yeah.
You know, like
seriously,
that is literally what Highland Ranch is. And like not to like, I don't mean to excuse anybody, but there's so much ignorance because there's a lack of diversity. Because they don't know and they don't like want to seek that out. Like, they're okay living in their bubble. They're okay with like being surrounded by people who look like them, and so that leads to so much arrogance.
Yeah, because you know, like, and it's like I want to scream from the rooftop. Like I work to get to where I'm at. You know, like working with Habitat and going through all those requirements with like your credit and volunteering. You know, it's like I worked hard to get here. Like you guys, like they, whoever they are, you know, they say, pull yourself up by your own bootstraps and work your way up and don't do this and do this and don't. It's like, okay, well, I did those things and now I'm here and now you guys are like beating me up because I'm here. So it's like, what do you want? You know, but I know I'm not that. So it's like, bring it in, go outside, woosah. But it's so hard to get away from stereotypes.
Yeah.
So that's why I'm glad we're having this conversation. So thank you. I think it is.
Lola in the comments put, I have so much privilege in my queer identity, and also I was kind of schooled about pretty
And that's very real. It's not something that's on here, but pretty privilege. We often wonder, like, what does that mean? Like, is that real? And sometimes it does fall into these colonial standards or Western standards of beauty. Sometimes, you know, it's like, oh wow, you have such a, like, I always get like, you have such a small nose, like that's so beautiful. And it's like, well, like, let's think about, like, why do we think this is beautiful? Because it's associated with whiteness. Like, it goes back to that video, like, what is the standard, even if we don't speak into it?
That's true.
We see Felicia has her hand up. Feel free to take the floor.
I heard your comments on pretty privilege, and I just had to jump in because I've actually, they're going along with pretty privilege. That is like almost a tongue twister. There's also like thin privilege and stuff too that a lot of people don't identify. And I'm, as a person who's been both plus size and what they call straight size or typical size at one point in my life, I can say that yes, when I was in those average sizes and when I was quote unquote thin, you know, it was real. Like, people were buying drinks for me. People were holding doors open for me. People, like, it was this. And like, now that I'm heavy and everything and alternative looking with dyed hair, there's so many people that just like freak out, ignore me and everything. And so there really is like those pretty privileges, those thin privileges and stuff that we don't often discuss and stuff, and they definitely do exist. And so I just heard that and I had to say, yes, absolutely, those exist.
So real, yeah.
It looks like a lot of people didn't get to finish their conversations. We would love to hear a little bit more about what y'all were talking about, if you would like to share. If you feel comfortable.
Es que nos dejaron a medias, mija, y pues no acabamos.
Something that we talked about was having white privilege, even though like we might not identify as white. I think like even for me, I'm pretty white passing. I recognize that privilege. And then even like with my speech, I don't have like a very heavy accent. So really, if you don't get to know me or ask, or if I don't just like start speaking Spanish, like no one usually knows that I speak Spanish or that I come from, you know, a different background, or they like get my background wrong. But just like recognizing that white passing privilege always, and knowing that I have that. And I think Danny related to that as well.
Does anyone else want to share and speak into this? It's okay if you don't. We're going to have more opportunities. We also want to recognize that because we had a bit of a late start with some technical issues and getting the Zoom link to work, if you need to leave right now, please feel free to do so, or like within the next 5 minutes once the session ends. But if everyone else is okay with staying on or staying in person, that would be really appreciated, just because this is a very fruitful conversation. And I think there's a lot that we can learn and connect with each other on.
Are we talking about oppression yet or no?
Yeah. Bill, you can bring up anything oppression.
Okay. It's I was like pretty privilege, oppression, I don't know. I don't really know what this falls under. It feels for me like it's identity, but I don't actually know Spanish, and I look like I would speak Spanish. I don't have like passing privilege, like white privilege, but my family grew up really close to the border and in a border town, but my father went to the military to like support his family, and everybody on the base spoke English. And my parents, we did start speaking Spanish very little. I do understand a lot of it, and I know the words, but I can't really like make it come out in a sentence, and I'm definitely not confident. I'm just not. I forget what the community organization is called locally that kind of helps like come to these meetings and translates. I don't know if they're here today, but I have never felt more comfortable in my life. Hey, I've never felt more comfortable in my life than when they're around, because just that I know I won't miss something in Spanish, I feel more comfortable and I can grasp more. But it's been my whole life I have felt that when people find out that I can't speak Spanish, because it's easy to tell, even if I just go into a restaurant and they look at me and they say something in Spanish and I know what they're saying, but I respond in English, there's always this moment where things change and you get treated a little bit differently.
I'd like to follow up with that because I've been bilingual now, and I used to not be. But also, so I got more in my native understanding, and I brought that up earlier, like our languages, even within our own Latino communities, speaking Spanish or no, it's kind of like a privilege to be around. If you don't speak Spanish, sometimes Spanish speakers, you feel outside. And I always try to remind my friends that Spanish language is also from Europe. It's also a colonizer language. Mm-hmm. So as much as my Chicano friends are like, yeah, I'm getting to my roots and I'm learning Spanish. And I'm like, pero you don't know the language of you're more Apache, and you actually have, Azteca, Maya blood in you. So you don't know any of those languages.
Mm-hmm. That's a really good point. Yeah, that's a really good point to bring up, Danny. That kind of goes back to the video that we were watching. I don't know if you're able to see it, Lola, but it mentioned about how there's a lot of different like shame and different stereotypes associated with people who don't speak English perfectly or as a first language, and generationally it's lost over time. And like Danny was saying about like different language and like colonized language, especially for Native people, it's very hard to learn that language or have accessibility to that language, either because you don't live in your homeland. Like for me personally, I didn't have very many resources to learn the Olelo Hawaii, the Native Hawaiian language, mostly through dancing hula. And even then it was like, I knew how to say rainbow and like, like hand motions, like the rains of Makaha, like different things, but you aren't able to form those sentences. And so there's a lot of shame associated with that, not being able to connect on that cultural level, because languages really just carry a different weight to them, because it's a whole different way of thinking, because, like subject before verb, verb before subject, adjectives, where do they all go? It all places importance on different areas. And so I just want to speak into that and reaffirm that, like, I feel you. It's always going to be a struggle, and that's something that will always change, learning new languages, reconnecting with your culture. So I'm grateful that everyone is starting on their journey somewhere.
Agregándole poquito a eso, yo quisiera como
adding a little bit to that, I'd also like to add, it's valid to not speak English and not to speak Spanish, but also it depends on the reaction that one has. It happened to me once that somebody didn't want to learn English, that the letters, the grammar was very difficult. She couldn't understand it. She was stressed about it. But responding with respect it has a lot to do with it, how we respond with respect. For example, when we would see a person, when I was a child, a long time ago, when I was a child, my mom would go with some people that she thought they spoke Spanish, and this person would say no, very unfriendly, say, no, I don't speak Spanish. She was offended. It has a lot to do on how we respond respectfully. That's my comment about that. And I'd like to add to that as well, that being Spanish for me was my first language, and going to school, at school I couldn't speak Spanish, so I lost a lot of my language in school. So when I would go back home and when I was with my family, everyone would criticize me because of my Spanish or my lack of it. But being at school and speaking in English, I would be criticized for not knowing enough English. So it's something very difficult, or it was something that was difficult. But things are changing now. Seeing that the both languages and how difficult it is to maneuver, to navigate, and still be criticized on both sides for not speaking English enough and for not speaking Spanish enough. Growing up with two languages and trying to navigate both. And it's hard to be perfect in both.
Repeat that in English if that's needed too.
You could do it like I do it. When I have to translate something, that I am like India Maria, a comedian from Mexican television.
Well, thank you everyone for sharing everything. This is such a great conversation. I feel like there's so many connections being made cross-culturally, with so many different identities coming into play right now.
I was just gonna ask if anyone would like to share anything else. I know we've already been talking for a while.
And again, will always be opportunities to bring this up. If anything here on this next slide comes up for you, please feel free to unmute yourself, raise your hand, whatever you would like, and you can have the floor to speak. But with that, we're going to keep moving on. Now let me share this next slide. And so we want to give a bit of an understanding about power and privilege in the United States. There's a little bit of this in the video, but we wanted to see and share systems of power. That's a whole nother conversation. There's a lot of systems of power in this country, but this is going to be a slight breakdown, a little 101.
That's a whole other.
Yeah. So most systems of power in the United States were historically shaped by colonization. And what colonization is a practice of domination which involves the subjugation of one people to another. So for example, this would be the indigenous people to this country or to this area, all across this continent. They were all subjected to colonization by force. The creation of the United States was built upon colonization. When Europeans came from England, all these other countries across the ocean, they subjugated all these different people. They enslaved Africans, brought them to the United States, what is now known as the United States, and forced people into these boxes that were expected of them. And if they didn't fit into those, then they didn't have any power to make any kind of changes. And so each of these systems were built to exclude people and preserve the power of the elite Europeans, these colonizers essentially. And so to see what it is that they were favored to, we have a whole list right here. And if you look at those lists, white, European men, cisgender, all these things, they match up with the charts that we were doing today. And so you can see that white European men, cisgender means that they is associated with the gender that they were born with, that they were assigned at birth, and heterosexual, their sexual orientation, thank you. Citizenship, which was a little bit rocky because they were originally immigrants, so who were they to say that they were the original citizens? English speaking, because that's what they brought over from Europe. Degree holding, some sort of higher education. Upper middle class, because that's where a lot of the money is. Ages 30 to 60, because historically that was the age where white men who were cisgender, heterosexual had I guess their lifespan was very like fruitful during that time. They hold a lot of like different jobs, different positions in politics. So that scene, if you're lower than 30, you don't earn respect. And if you're older than 60, you might as well be dead to them. They probably won't care about you. And lastly, the religion was Christian because that's what they came over with. And so this is what shapes our power systems today in the United States still. It was something that was kind of talked about in the video, how it was the invisible expectation of whiteness, but this is the list right in front of you of what is expected, even if it's not said.
And so we'd like to emphasize that all of these identities hold privilege in themselves because they are like what was originally favored as elite and what is currently favored as being part of the elite. So if you do have any of these identities, then you do have privilege. That doesn't mean that like your whole life is privileged. It just means that that singular identity gives you some sort of privilege. So if you have access to education, so you have some sort of college or vocational training or anything of that sort, then you have educational privilege, right? That doesn't necessarily mean that you are privileged in the sense of your race. That just means that your identity in terms of education has privilege. So we'd like to ask y'all to circle or highlight any of the parts of your chart where you have privilege. So like for me, I would circle national origin because I have US citizenship. For some, they might circle their abilities because they might be able-bodied. If y'all feel comfortable, would anyone like to just speak out an identity that they circled? No need to explain if you don't want to. Education.
For me, I have kind of a double one. So I was raised middle class, and that was influenced by the fact that my ancestry is white, and so I have economic privilege. And so because some of my ancestors came from Europe and some of mine came from other countries like Hawaii, Vietnam, Japan, I'm able to benefit off that white privilege economically, even if I don't look white.
Let me just make sure. This is the one with like the different categories that's got different colors on it?
Yes.
Okay.
So I've got kind of I don't know if it's too unique, but I've noticed I benefit from heterosexual privilege that, says hetero monogamy privilege of society, but it's not my identity because I'm actually pansexual. And I think says gender, but I'm also, I guess I actually should say I'm more gender fluid, but I'm mostly feminine. And so I don't know how to handle that when like societally, I definitely benefit from says heteronormativity, but identity wise, it's almost like an internal crisis sometimes because it's like, it's not me. And so I just,
oh my God, yes, speak it. Like people don't know that I have the privilege of like going to a bathroom, though I feel like more gender expansive sometimes, like I can go in there and use it because of the way I present.
Yes, I understand that. It's so hard because I definitely, I'm obviously white. I benefit from white privilege. I've been benefited from European privilege. I grew up upper middle class. I'm degree holding. I'm in my 30s to 60s. There's a lot of things on there on the privilege list that I can understand for power. And then there's just some of them that like I can see where I benefit from power, but I'm also being hurt by those same mechanisms of power because growing up with the heteronormative society, it didn't let me really claim my sexual identity until I was older, because when I was younger and said I was, well, then I said I was bisexual because I didn't understand the whole expansiveness of the spectrum. And so, but they told me bisexuality doesn't exist. You're either a lesbian or you're straight and you have to pick. And so, I mean, it pretty much, that determined, you know, at one point I thought, okay, well, I guess I have to pick. And it literally controlled a lot of who I became. But now that I'm older and there's a lot more awareness, like, no, I'm absolutely not straight. And so there's a lot that goes into just the internal kind of crisis of that there for me.
Well, I think that's like the work, right? Acknowledging that privilege, even if like you don't relate to that or relate to a certain label, but like you're doing the work and you're acknowledging that privilege. And I think like that's what really counts, you know?
Yeah, and making sure, bringing awareness to that too, and making sure my children understand it too, because I'm raising kids and I don't want them to, my parents didn't talk to this stuff about me. They weren't openly racist or anything, but they definitely didn't educate me on any of this. And I want to make sure my kids have an understanding when they grow up, so.
Well, thank you all for speaking into that. I love that there's so many connections we made. I know I say it every time, but it's like we pick new identities and it's like we're finding these intersections that we can all relate on in some way or another, even if it's not exactly the same. So thank you all for speaking into that. We definitely want to be respectful of people's time. We want to try and end this session by 7:15. So we want to end with a couple of closing remarks. Again, if people want to continue this conversation because you enjoy this, you want to share narratives to create this solidarity, we can stay on longer, but we will cut it at 7:15 so that people don't feel guilty about leaving early or late, technically. So Naomi, can you go to not the next one, but the one after, please?
So why are these conversations important? We had 3 main points for this. The first one being solidarity. So when we see our similarities instead of our differences, we can see that our struggles against the systems of power are intertwined. So really, my liberation is your liberation. Because of going back to like that intersectionality, our identities are very similar. Even though our experiences might be different, there are resounding themes because we face similar oppression when we deal with these systems of power. So that's a really, really important like phrase for me, is saying that your liberation is tied with my liberation. And that's really, you know, saying that we need to work together to accomplish well, for me, it's abolition, but for other people, it might be something else. And so power is that, for me, people power is much stronger than individual power. And even though we are oppressed, we have power through our different identities to advocate for other communities. Just because we don't have power in the sense of like these institutions in the face of, you know, like the society, doesn't mean that we don't have individual power. We have our voices. We have community power, we have people power, and everybody has different abilities and skills and characteristics that they bring to the table. So we have to acknowledge that just because there are these systems of power, or because the white man or whatever you want to call it is saying that we don't have power, like we do. And when we come together, like that power is so much more stronger than when we are apart. So cheesy. And then our narrative. So we talked a little bit about owning our stories. So really like owning our experiences and sharing our narrative inspires change. A couple of us shared how that has already happened in our lives, and that's really because there's power in our stories. So you can see that all 3 of these are intertwined, that they're all important, they're all very intersectional. And you know, I think that the biggest takeaway from this is that each person has the power to inspire one another. We have the power to organize, to get together, and we really do that by coming together as a community, by sharing our stories and our experiences.
Yeah, You summed that up really great. Thank you, Damar. With that, we want to close out. We also want to give this space to everyone. And you could stay and talk about this longer if you want. Feel free to hop off now. It is 7:15. Naomi, if you can go to the next slide. We want to close with this. Again, don't feel pressure to stay. But how can we use our privilege to advocate for people of different identities? So now that we've talked about different ways that we benefit, different ways that we've experienced oppression, how can we change this into action?
And this is the practice of inclusion.
This is the verb. How are we going to do this?
So that was really our call to action. María?
No, yo nada más quería decir como el
Well, I
privilegio.
only wanted to say that the privilege of being Hispanic, but to be bilingual, I can help my people, helping people that do not understand another language. I can help with that. That's all.
That's very powerful, taking something that would be typically associated with oppression and turning it into a power. So thank you, changing that perspective.
Systems of oppression and the people being the oppressors often don't want to listen to the people who they are oppressing. And so work within the systems that you have the privilege in to undo that oppression of the oppressed systemically, because they're going to listen to people who are like them before they're going to listen to the people who are opposite of them.
I also think there's like power to taking control of your own narrative and taking the things that maybe you don't think are privileges, and using that and like working with that. And I think like when you are in a place with like multiple identities, you can you have your experiences and you can work off of that, off of the experiences that you've lived, and choose like what you want to change because of it. I know like if I didn't have certain experiences, I wouldn't probably be in the work that I'm doing. So having that, I think it's both like it's not a privilege, but it's also a privilege to use it, in a meaningful way to create change, if that made any sense.
Makes sense to me.
Showing up in these spaces, where decisions are going to be made, or if there's like educational learning, to learn and to just, speak my piece. Because I know a lot of times, like, people don't show up to the school board and share things that might affect their kid. So like when me have an African-American son, it's going to be important to me to like go to the, conferences, or I don't know, what's the word? School board. Yeah, school board meetings. You got me.
I've learned that we don't always know when we're having a teachable moment. And the best thing we can do is just go slow and steady. A lot of times when we're in situations and we're dealing with community activism, we feel like it needs to be immediate. And I'm not going to say that a lot of times it doesn't need to be immediate. But if we have the time to take a second and take a step back and try to see that whole picture, like the narrative, like you were saying, and our perspectives, we can really do a lot more good. Because sometimes, because we are humans, we get stuck, or we tell ourselves an old story, or we're making judgments about people. But if we want to be leaders, we need to leave the judgment at the door. We need to see those perspectives, and we need to really make sure that we are calling ourselves in before we are calling others out. And I think just treating every day and every moment that we can as a teachable moment will really, really help.
Me encantó su comentario de la señora Lola y
I loved your commentary, Lala. And adding to that, in the past, things are past. We can't change it. There are people that already have racism in the past, in their hearts, but we can teach our children to be different. We need to teach our children that no one is more important than another, not simply because we are different, but I tell my children, you are special because of what you do, because of what you are. But the love that you can show to others is a privilege. Everyone has their privilege. But we must not misuse that privilege, is what I'm trying to say.
I wanted to share one thing that I've been thinking about. So I do identify in the LGBTQ community, but I also identify as a cisgender woman. And so I don't have the same experiences of our trans members of the community. And I'm also able-bodied. So, you know, there's a lot of lack of access to healthcare right now, especially with so many different policies being passed, barring people from having just that access and acceptance in different healthcare systems. And so that's something that I want to use my privilege to advocate for, especially for trans women of color who have such a low, I don't want to say survival rate, what's the word? Well, y'all know what I mean.
Yeah.
There's a very high mortality rate for trans women of color, especially those with disabilities. And so I want to use my privilege to uplift them, advocate for them, and do anything I can in my power to make sure that they have the access that they need to healthcare, whether it's through, you know, formal healthcare systems or through cultural healthcare, alternative methods, you know, anything that we can to ensure that they're safe and they can have a long life ahead of them.
Is anyone else called to share something? Okay.
Well, let's just decompress. There's been a lot of conversations going on about you know, privilege, oppression, what we've benefited from, what we've had different losses in. So if we all want to take a second, have a grounding moment, you know, like put your feet on the ground, loosen up your shoulders, give them a little roll, take a deep breath in, a deep breath out. And just as we called ourselves into this space for grounding and to be present in this moment, let's also recognize that this space is about to close and we want to let that energy go that we've been holding on to, that tension, you know, your neck around, anything that makes you feel calm. This work is uncomfortable. This work is challenging, but this is the work that needs to be done if we want to achieve that liberation for all communities in every system of power that we have access to. We have the privilege to be in, privilege to have power in any sense, any capacity. Take another deep breath in. Let it out. With this last deep breath we're about to take, I want it to fill up your lungs and then release it and feel it leave through your feet that are planted, through your fingertips. Release all of that energy. Leaving this space protected, more on your way to healing, more on your way to understanding yourself, the people around you, and your journeys. Hopefully having that compassion that we've been talking about today. Thank you, everyone.
Awesome.
Thank you, Claire. That was so sweet.
Thank you.
one last ask before everyone leaves. Kealohi dropped a feedback form in the chat. This is really, really useful for us in planning our future sessions. We actually today decided to add another session so that we can keep talking about what we've shared today and a little bit about community organizing. But we would love to get some feedback on how today went. This is Kealohi and I's first presentation together, so we would love some feedback on the topics that we covered, on our teaching style, on our facilitation skills. So please go ahead and fill that out. We don't need to have a lot of information. We would just love to hear what y'all have to say. So appreciate you all staying for this long and for dealing with all those technical difficulties. We'll be back again next Friday at 5:30. Same Zoom link, same location if you're in person, and we'll be covering community organizing. So hope to see y'all next Friday. Awesome. Take care.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.
Thank you, Sam.
Thank you, Sam. Oh.
Bye.